Hello and welcome to Dig This, a podcast by The Quarry. Today we're going to be talking about one of the most important sites in Europe, the Fouaillages. It dates back some 7,000 years and is still throwing up more secrets today.
Yes, I discovered it in 1976 by a series of happy coincidences, really. First of all, as a child, I was so interested in archaeology and in the Lucas and Island Museum that I was well versed in the extant monuments already. During the Second World War, the Germans absolutely devastated Lancrest Common, including the extraction of a large amount of sand for the building of bunkers. And in 1975, perhaps 1976, there was a gorse fire on that portion of Lancrest Common. So I was walking across the common with my late wife, and we came across an area of burning. And it's always interested, if you're interested in archaeology, areas of burning are always good for having a scratch around. And the first thing that struck me was that there were two granite boulders, possibly half a metre across, which were next to each other. And one of them was one sort of granite and the other one was another sort of granite. So although you get outcrops on the common, which might suggest that there's just a natural rock coming out, one of those had been taken there, and the implication is that they were part of an old structure. There was very little to see because it's an earth mound, so the only thing to do was actually to make arrangements with the Societe to have a little controlled dig on it.
And that first controlled dig, what did that show?
Well, it was a 2 metre wide strip down the side of the mound, and it was the thing that was the clincher was that we came straight down on the curb. There is a defining curb of stones, relatively small stones, that run all around the monument. Very big at the beginning, but as it tails off, they get smaller. And there it was. And between the stones, flints. Between the stones, prehistoric pottery. It was a clincher. Mm.
And there was a bigger dig after that. Was it the year afterwards?
Sorry?
What happened after that? Was there was a bigger dig that followed?
Yes, exactly. So Ian Kinnis from the British Museum was called down by Bob Burns of the Societe, the Archaeology secretary of the Societe, to have a look at the site. So he was flown in from the British Museum, Dr. Ian Kinnis, and he looked at the site, and it sort of struck him straight away that the things that we'd recovered just from near the surface were potentially enormous. And so he arranged with the States and the Lancrest Commons Council, of course, who are particularly sensitive about digging on the common, to run some excavations.
I mean, and I guess in the 50 years or so that's followed, this site has been throwing up all sorts of information. If someone can put it into some context now as well.
I think it's true to say it's never had it's never been treated as well as it deserved, put it that way. There's a long history which we're hopefully now sort of finally starting to address, of it not being published, which is something that happens in archaeology time and time again. It's great fun digging sites up, but actually it takes an awful lot longer to write up what you found. And it was a very complicated, complex excavation. There was a huge quantity of finds. John has mentioned the pottery and flint. I think the figure is something like 36,000 pieces of flint and pottery. It was an unusual site for Guernsey. It was a kind of site we hadn't had before and wasn't particularly well known from the sort of neighbouring bits of France. And you have an excavator who comes in from outside, has the funding for the sort of the 3-week excavation seasons, but then is, back in the day job the rest of the time.
Yes, can I say that one of the things that struck me as a very amateur archaeologist at the time was how enormously destructive archaeology is. And so the record is everything at the end of the day.
Yeah. There's also that I would probably have to be slightly careful what I say about him. But the excavator, Ian Kinnis, who's no longer with us, who died about 10 or 12 years ago now, was not an easy person to work with. And it's also true to say, I think, that he had made less progress with writing up the work than most of us thought. So, and there was, towards the end of his life, there was a sort of renewed effort to try and bring it all together with some French colleagues around about 2009, 2010. But then Ian died, and it's only really in the last couple of years as a couple of other people have got involved, and John has been going through all the original source material again, that hopefully we're getting a little bit closer to someone, to another specialist actually, putting all the material together and actually giving the fouillage the sort of the prominence it deserves, because it does require a very sort of specialist skill set. It's someone who knows prehistoric pottery and flint, and we know a little bit about them, but we don't know enough to sort of do this work to sort of to its full extent. So sort of that's where we are with it now.
Yeah. And I think Tanya can tell us the importance and the time span which is covered, which I think the current archaeologists are very, very keen to look at again.
Yes, I mean, the time period that it spans is quite amazing, really. I mean, I think they got a radiocarbon date for 4,800 BC for the very earliest phases. And as Phil said, it's a really complex monument because it changes over time, and its story continues right down to about 2000 BC when you get the final sealing off. So you've got thousands of years worth of use there, and it's really complicated. And the excavation times as well was the very beginnings of radiocarbon dating too. So I think they've only got the one date.
There's a few. There are a few. Yes. Yeah.
But with the technology that we have now, so much more could be done.
Yeah.
But that comes back to the destruction of archaeology again.
Yes, that's right. I think it would have been better if he'd left a little bit.
And can you, because as I understand it, from where we are now, there's a few phases to how that site was used. Could you explain a little bit about where we are with that thinking at the moment?
Well, we're reliant on the record. And one of the things John and I were thinking about this morning was that it would be quite good if the two or three people that would really like to be here as well to talk aren't here. I mean, Ian Kinnis is one, but also Bob Burns, who was very involved, and he's gone. There were volunteers involved on the site, local and otherwise, but not perhaps in the organisation and the recording of it all. So we're reliant on those written records,
written
the
records,
finds, the monument, the photographs, and to try and bring it together to work out those phases.
As Tanya said, the earliest phase seems to be about 4,800, which is really very, very early for a funerary monument. I mean, this is where Les Fouaillages has a particular importance beyond just Guernsey or the Channel Islands, because it's one of the very earliest sort of man-made monuments for the dead, really. You seem to start getting possibly standing stones are first, and in the 6th millennium BC, in the sort of second half of that. So you're looking at sort of 5,500 BC, possibly a little bit earlier, a little bit later. In Brittany, around Karnak, you start getting standing stones being built. And then the very earliest tombs, like the Fouaillages, round about 5,000, which is also the time when we first get Neolithic settlement dates and we've now got a few from Guernsey, one from not very far from where we're sat, one from what was the Royal Hotel site, the other side of town. There's very early Neolithic settlement there, one from the work we did up at the end of the airport runway a few years ago. That was about 5,000 BC. And there's another really early, possibly even earlier, about 5,200 from Lihou, near the car park for going across to Lihou. And that's the earliest sort of signs of people, of actual Neolithic, the new Stone Age settlement, people actually settling down, starting to cultivate crops and moving away from the Mesolithic, from the hunter-gatherer lifestyle. And the Fouaillages is the first actual sort of place for the burial of their dead that we can associate with that earliest settlement, and it predates the bigger structures, the Vard and the Lihou, by a good 700 or 800 years, something like that.
It's quite likely that there were still hunter-gatherers on the island at this time, and one of the things that a lot of archaeologists are asking at the moment is the transition between the hunter-gatherers and the colonizing new Stone Age people that came in.
What do we know about Guernsey in that time as well? Because it didn't look like it looks today, does it?
No,
bigger?
It was a bit bigger, yeah, although it is an important point that it was certainly already an island by that time, and it had been an island probably for the best part 4,000 years, certainly by that point. So when you start thinking about ideas coming in, as well as some actual goods possibly, or imported stone, we've got a couple of imported bits of flint that are a bit later, but when you're looking at stuff coming in, it's got to be coming by across the water. So there must be dugout canoes, boats, there must have been transport across the water going on, so they were capable of moving across probably from the Cotentin. And as Tanya said, the island a little bit bigger, although the main post the end of the Ice Age sea level rise has happened by the time that the Fouaillages is being constructed. But I think if you were long lived, you probably saw, you visibly saw the sea level was still rising.
There may have been folk memories as well.
Yeah, yeah.
Or, it's 4,000 years, but there could have been folk memories of such things.
Yeah, yeah.
And we're talking about a forested area as well, or is that?
Yeah.
Certainly more than now.
Yes, yes.
How much
That's
is the
right,
question.
because I think that the hunter-gatherers were not cutting down trees, large trees, so it's quite likely that there were a lot of very large trees on the island, which is the biggest change that the Neolithic people would have brought in, because they had the capability to cut down trees to clear the land and to cultivate it. But having said that, the Landcrest Common probably never had a lot of trees on it. It would have been fairly scrubby, and it would have been
soil, isn't it, relative to other
would have
parts of
been
the island?
easier to clear. But largely the island would have been heavily wooded, I think.
Yeah.
And you spoke a little bit about some of the changing techniques that can help put this story together. Where are we now with?
I think, well, one of the reasons for the more recent interest, which a colleague of ours from Brittany, particular LNPFA, is interested in, is getting more information on the environmental evidence, because we can do a lot more with that now than we could even back in the 70s when it was originally excavated. So one of the things I think she wants to look for around the fouillage is more information on what the vegetation was, what the landscape was like, and also to sort of perhaps answer the question of to what extent people were actually living around the tomb as well, because historically there always tends to be a bit of a focus on the monument, but in more recent years archaeologists have generally tried to sort of broaden, to look around the monument as well. And when Kynnes excavated, he did actually excavate an area adjacent to the tomb as well, which if I remember rightly had Bronze Age settlement,
Bronze Age,
so it
yes.
had quite late. I mean, the sort of the time when the monument was effectively closed, when it was sort of finished with. But there is there early Neolithic settlement to be found around there as well. Ironically, having put a couple of trenches in last year nearby, we actually found 12th century AD settlement, fairly close to the fouillage, which was rather unexpected, but is an interesting, again, it's an interesting sort of indicator of how the land has changed, and the sand blows which have come in and covered everything. This sort of little 12th century building is about 2 meters down in the sand, but obviously it was viable back then, as a place to live, and it sort of reinforces the thing that we've always got to remember. It's true for Landcrest. It's very much true for the north end of Herm is what else could be buried underneath all that sand, because there must be Neolithic occupation down
that
there
comes
as
back
well.
to what you were saying about was the island different at that time? And yes, because it was an obvious place to go and live and to farm in the early and middle Neolithic, because all this sand blowing event hadn't happened yet.
So when did that sand blow?
Happened in phases, didn't it?
Yeah, we've got some evidence for it happening sort of towards the end of prehistory, the end of the Iron Age in Alderney, but most of what we see over here is early medieval, sort of end of the Roman period, and then you do start. There are actually once you get into the first millennium AD, there are literary and historical references as well to this happening, and certainly the sort of 7th, 8th, 9th century into even beyond that. There must have been terrific storms and just huge quantities of sand just inundating places and making them completely uninhabitable.
Yeah, I mean, we've got quite a lot of evidence for it, really, haven't we? Because, I mean, there's the little building up by the Fouaillages that started this bit of the conversation, but there's the Cobo Longhouse, which was found in the 60s over near Cobo, all buried in sand. And we've the same thing with Longey on Alderney, which we've seen and is also recorded, as you say, historically. So sometimes these things could happen quite quickly, it appears. So somewhere someone was living, just about, has just become unviable and they've got to go because the sand blow is too much. Must have been different. Sometimes it happened a bit and sometimes it happened a lot, I think.
And that sand blow, they've been quite obviously very important because they've managed to protect these sites, hide these sites. So there's a story I remember about during the German occupation, they came very close to almost wiping out the site, didn't it? There's some marks.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, so one of the things that the excavation showed was some very big claw marks, which after a bit of head scratching, somebody came up on site and said, well, the Germans had a big steam shovel and they were taking sand from the common at this point, and they'd actually sort of got to the point where they've scraped a few stones and said, oh, that's as far as we go for our sand. And so so fortunately they were just after good sand. Interesting.
And does that throw up any difficulties as archaeologists as well? Because there's various survey techniques, aren't they? But if what you're looking for is buried under, I don't know how much sand that we're talking about though.
It is difficult. I mean, it would be quite nice to go back and excavate that medieval house on Lancresse next to the Fouaillages, but it is a good 2 meters down, and digging sand is great in one way because it's very easy to shift, but you can't keep the bulks, the sections upright. If you want to sort of really get down sort of 2 or 3 meters, you've got to dig a very big hole so that the sections sort of can fall in a bit. So yeah, on the one hand, it's great for its preservation sort of qualities, but logistically, it's quite difficult to deal with. It's I won't sort of get sidetracked into Alderney too much, but this is a big problem we have with the work we've been doing on Alderney, where we have a superb site, but there's 3 meters of sand on top of it, and dealing with that is really quite problematic.
I mean, the Fouaillages wasn't buried under the Germans had moved quite a bit.
I think this is it. I think if the Fouaillages had been found with the sand still there, I think asking the Commons Council if you could come in with a very large excavator and remove 300 or 400 tons of sand, I think they might have balked at that. So the Germans were part of the story.
Moving into to look at the finds that you've had so far, what have you discovered and what are they telling us?
A lot of it is, like I said, the sort of 36,000 sherds or whatever is pretty, I'm not going to say dull isn't quite the right word, because it does require a sort of
special mind.
A very special mind to appreciate all of it. I mean, I think most of us probably more enjoy, what it altogether tells us. But obviously there are particular items like the little flint arrowheads that effectively closed the use of the tomb. So these are down into the Bronze Age, probably sort of 2,500, 2,300 BC, something like that. So there were 8 of these beautiful little flint arrowheads, 4 of them in a sort of amber-coloured flint, 4 of them in the darker flint. And the amber-coloured flint is probably an import from either from Grand Pressini, which is just south of the Loire Valley, or somewhere in that vicinity. And the dark flint has come in from the east, from Normandy, from across near Caen. Either way, it is imported. One of the I don't know if it's one of the joys of dealing with flint in Guernsey, or with the flint that we find as archaeologists in Guernsey, is that we're restricted to beach pebbles. That's the only natural source material. So most of our flint is pretty poor quality because it's being eroded out of an underwater deposit somewhere up north of Alderney, and it's rolling down the seabed, and it's being picked up on our beaches. And although occasionally you get sort of big size nodules, most of it is just hand size stuff. So the quality in the sort of Neolithic flint world or whatever is really poor, and stuff like the arrowheads
Jump
are
out.
exceptional. Yeah.
And I think that they were probably made very late on in the Neolithic and possibly into the Bronze Age, and so they would have been made as votive offerings.
Yeah.
There are how many of them?
There's 8.
There's 8. Four of one flint and 4 of another, and they're beautifully made, and they match. They must have been brought from continental Normandy, as it is now, for that very purpose. And they're just quite. And I think also this miniature axe here, which is very well. It's rather nice, but it's not very practical for cutting a tree down. It's votive, I think, again. It was something that was made to represent the past almost, and put it as a votive offering to the ancestors. Perhaps
there's an interesting possible parallel between the shape of the tomb at the Fouillage and an axe, because in fact it is, when you look at it from above, it is basically axe shaped, and that may be significant. Axes, we do get imported stone axes occasionally, but that's one thing where the local stone is actually very good for the production of polished stone axes. So we have. Well, there's certainly several from the Fouillage and hundreds from the island as a whole. So clearly, even if they had to import the nicest flint, they were able to manufacture locally some very fine polished stone axes. And some, unlike this one, as John was saying, that is sort of more or less almost decorative, some are, substantial size that you could actually use as very effective tools.
I don't know how the axe density compares in anywhere really, but thinking perhaps about Jersey, because it would be easy to compare. I hadn't thought about that before, because it's a real density of axes.
It is, yeah.
From here.
There is an element, I think, because we're sort of so removed from the production of things like this, I think there is an instinct to look at something like that and think, wow, that must have taken, months to make or whatever. And actually it didn't. There are 1 or 2 people now who do reproduction stone axes, and, they'll knock one out in a day. And if you knew what you were doing, actually they weren't quite as, quite as time consuming as you might think. And they must have used thousands.
Yeah, and they get damaged,
because,
don't they, and resharpened.
Yeah, until the Bronze Age, until you get metal coming in, the stone and flint is what you have to make use of, really, for any sort of heavyweight tools.
Obviously, amongst all the finds down there, there's been pottery as well, and I don't know, it's down when La Societe Open Day, and they were speaking about the pottery a bit as well, and maybe some reinterpretation.
We took the pots, didn't we?
Yeah,
the reconstructed pots for that visit.
Yeah. Well, like the monument itself, the pottery is extremely early. I'm not a pot specialist.
But
Tanya's
how much of it is extremely early? Because we always think about those 2 beautifully reconstructed pots, which are really early and belong with the first phase, and are of a type of pottery which is quite well known from continental Europe, but was unusual to find here. And I don't know how common it would be in the British Isles. Very, very rare if it even exists
Yeah, it's
there.
very rare. Yeah, because,
Yes, but the sort of thing that I think that we don't really, that hopefully will come out of this new exercise is that what proportion of the pottery from the excavation is of that nature? Because quite a lot of it might turn out to be later as well, because you've got this very long period of use of the monument right into the Bronze Age and the arrowheads. So what proportions fit with the different times?
Presumably quite a lot of the pottery is locally made as well.
How do you tell?
You know, it's there, like with the flint arrowheads, there are clearly some pots that are being imported from France, but they can't have imported everything. They must have been making pottery locally as well.
And unless you've got something diagnostic on the pottery sherds that you're finding, it's quite difficult to say whether you're dealing with an early Neolithic piece of pottery or even one into the late Neolithic or Bronze Age. If it's a small bit, you need something that's giving you clues. Imported is great. If you've got that, well, that helps. But patterns or enough of a piece of pottery to show the shape, the form of the vessel, then you can start to sort of talk about the time period. But if you're dealing with lots and lots of little bits, that's tricky.
Yeah, but nowadays they can do analysis on the small inclusions of stone that are used to temper the pots. So maybe that might be a clue, because you can say if it was put sandstone inclusions or inclusions from limestone, we don't have either in Guernsey, so you can say, well, they're imported, and you might even be able to say where they were imported from.
But a lot of it will be local. That's the trouble, isn't it? There will be imported bits, and maybe there are some imported bits from later as well, which can be identified, as you're saying, but a lot of it, like the flint and the pottery, will be locally sourced, which is more difficult to say a lot about.
The one find we haven't got, we should say something about, of course, is bone. We haven't got any human bone from the site, ironically, given that it's a burial monument. But and usually sand does help in preservation, but I think
it came too late.
It's too late, yeah, basically. I mean, we dig up sort of medieval burials that are 500 years old and almost entirely returned to the soil already. So you can easily see that something that was buried there in 5000 or 4000 BC is going to have decayed away completely well before any sort of sand came along with sort of preservative impacts on that. But it does make it means that one of the sort of the big unknowns, I suppose, is how many people were buried in this monument, and also, you know, we just don't know anything about them, and also the size of the settlement, or the size of the population around it. This is something that we just don't get the information from, and it brings me back to something I wanted to say about the stones. One of the things that I always say when we take primary kids to the fouillage is that you look at it, and most of the stones could be moved by, in fact, between the four of us, we could probably move every single stone on that site. A couple would, take a bit of effort, a lever or something. But when you compare it to somewhere like Lihou up on the hill, where you're looking at a capstone of 30 tons, it's really quite small scale. And this is one of the things that sort of differentiates it from the later dolmens. This sort of earliest phase of monument building, it could be done with a relatively small population. You're certainly not having to get a couple of hundred people in to try and drag some massive stone up the hill to the Vard. So it's possible it's quite a small community involved in this. And that also leads into I'm just sort of going off on other sort of personal bugbears or whatever here. But another thing is just the one thing that fascinates me is how it was organised, because you're obviously in a society where the only means of communicating is like we're doing now. It's face-to-face talking to someone. There's really no other option. So when you do start needing a few dozen people or a couple of hundred people, and you need to arrange a time when you're going to do this and who's going to provide the food and all that sort of the sort of organisation of it fascinates me, about how that was actually arranged.
I mean, one way that they could have done it is by times of the year, by observing the sunrises. And we've also seen that usually the entrances of the big megalithic tombs are aligned on the sort of equinoctial times of the year, either spring or autumn. So they're perhaps using a calendar from observing. The fouillage, interestingly, is the odd one out, because although it's aligned in roughly the same direction, it's way off. Maybe it was less important because the population that was using it was much smaller. So they weren't gathering people from around a bigger part of the island. It's just a suggestion.
Yeah. It's sort of, did you say northeast, John?
It's northeast in a general sense, but it's a little bit north of northeast, whereas most of the others actually can be aligned with a sunrise. Either the midwinter sunrise in the case of the Vard, or perhaps a summer sunrise with some of the others. But this one is out of alignment, and it's one of the little mysteries of it. Somebody's suggesting that it could be aligned with a moonrise, because the moon does rise further from the north in certain cases, but I think that's speculative.
Yeah. And moving into some of the more modern work that that has been done on the site. So when did the digs with the French, when did that all come about, and how did that all come about?
They've done 2 years now.
They've done two years, haven't they? Yeah. I mean, Hélène, we've mentioned Hélène a couple of times, Hélène Pierrefait. She actually studied the pottery from the Fouaillages as her PhD in Brittany some years ago, when all the material was taken to Caen, when Ian Kinnis, he'd retired from the British Museum and he'd moved to Normandy, and the material was all taken to France so that several French archaeologists could work on it, because they were more familiar with this sort of material. And Hélène did the prehistoric pottery at that time, and she now has a job in Morbihan, not including the Karnak region, but I think she does everything in Morbihan that isn't Karnak, ironically. But she's maintained her interest in the islands, and managed to secure some French government funding a couple of years ago to come and start, as I think we said, to start looking more at the context of the fouillage and the area around it. So that's really that's one of the reasons that there's this renewed interest in it. And also another person who needs to be named and sort of thanked is Alison Sheridan, who is now retired curator from National Museum of Scotland. And Alison has got a very long and distinguished sort of publishing history of looking at the Neolithic, sort of early Neolithic settlement all the way up the Atlantic coast, Scotland, Orkneys, Isle of Man, all the stuff down to the Channel Islands. And she was also a good friend of Ian Kinnis and his widow, and it was really Alison who, I think, actually said to to Barbara, Ian Kidnes's widow, that she would get the Fouaillages published.
She's promised the widow that she would do the publication, and it's imminent now because Alison Sheridan has been in contact with me. She's hoping to come down in May to see us here, but the interesting thing is that a lot of the archive in terms of written material is actually in Edinburgh.
Which is where she lives.
Which is where she lives. And the material archive and the drawings are all in Guernsey. And the work that was done towards the publication is all in Edinburgh. So between me and Alison, we're trying to bring the two together. But at the moment, I'm working most weeks just for a few hours in the museum, looking at the actual archive in terms of the materials and in terms of the drawings, so that when she comes to write the publication, I'll be able to assist from this end.
It's a difficult process trying to get into the head of the excavator. I mean, we've probably all done it to some extent. I certainly wrote up some of Bob Burns's work, and however good the records are, and often they're not great, to actually sort of understand a site as the person who sort of directed the excavation is really difficult. And with a site as complex as the Fouaillages, that is really quite a challenge. But someone like Alison is the sort of one of the few people who could do it just because of her huge knowledge of that period. Yeah.
Yes. And if the write-up poses questions, then it'll be documented, and archaeologists, European archaeologists, can start to pick holes in it and say, oh yeah, well, and it's a focus for discussion, and it's a focus for moving the understanding on.
There's also practicalities that come out of the archive, which we were talking about before. For example, were all the stones, even the biggest ones, completely moved? Because if they were, that's a shame, because there are now techniques where you can do luminescence dating of sediments underneath the stones and get dating it that way, which people weren't thinking about in the 1970s. But how do we find out if all the stones were moved? You would hope that it would be somewhere in the archive, particularly in the site books and the site records that were kept of day-to-day working. But until you go through it all, and even then, you might not find out because they might not have bothered to mention that, which would be a shame.
It was a very long time ago, and my memory fails me quite a lot in actual detail like that. But there was a man who was very interested in what we were doing called Bill Tipping, and he was an amateur photographer, and he did a wonderful photographic record. So some of them are of an archaeology standard, but an awful lot of them are stuff going on.
And that's quite good, because as archaeologists, you take record shots of what you want to record. And when you come to look at a big picture, it's not always what you wanted to record. It's but what was just off the edge? Why didn't we photograph that? So somebody coming along, photographing for a very different reason, or videoing, which is something that you're doing quite now of excavations, picks up some of these peripheral things, which can be very useful later on.
I guess you never know what's going to be, how techniques are going to develop, or what does become important. Did any of those, so we spoke a little bit about the dig and the medieval house that it showed. Has anything else come out of these digs that you can talk about at this stage?
We don't have most of the results
yet. We're waiting on the big report.
Yes, we're waiting on a report, but hopefully there will be environmental evidence. Yes. Did they not get quite a lot of Roman material from one of those test pits as well? am I
The
imagining
Fouaillages test pits.
One of the ones in the gorse bushes, not last year, but the year before. Was there
Looking
not?
at you were there.
No. Because one of the things that I think Ian Kinnis suggested was that long after the mound has sort of disappeared from use, as it were, it might have been enough of a feature for to sort of come up in land boundaries and things like that that were put on land crests, and I think at least some of which he suggested were Iron Age or possibly Roman in date. So there may be environmental information and what have you coming up about that, about relatively sort of late occupation on the site as well. But really, as Tanya said, we're still awaiting.
And that's quite imminent because it's part of the funding process for this year's work. So, I mean, it's done, as I understand it, and we should get to see it. This is not any fine publication, but the publication of the work they've done so far for the 2 years we should see it within the next few weeks. So that will be really good, and that will have information, I hope, about the analysis of the soils they've done, the environmental information, as well as all the finds, because it's not only the fouillage they've been working at. This is just one aspect of a much bigger project to look at the context. So we've also got work in Herm that they've done as well. And next year, not next year, it's next year now, they're also hoping to expand the geographical areas they're working in this coming year.
And there's another eminent archaeologist, Professor Chris Scarr, who will be coming down in May as well.
Yes, he's been involved all along, hasn't he? Particularly in the work in Herm, where he'd worked previously as well.
He's done a certain amount of work in Brittany as well, I think. But he's hoping to come down and actually try to get, by re-excavating or excavating a little bit on the fouillage itself, to try to get a carbon date, which would be very important.
If we were just to wrap it up and try and put the fouillage into some sort of context and why it's important. I don't know, I'll go to each of you individually here. Phil,
I would say it's because it's this unusually early funerary monument. We don't really know what people did with their dead in the Mesolithic. There's a couple of sites in Brittany where you get one thing we know they did off the coast of Brittany, at least in one place, was put bodies in limpet middens. There's some huge mounds of limpets which have some Mesolithic burials in them, but that's pretty exceptional. But one of the sort of defining features, if you like, of the change to the Neolithic is people start to I suppose monumentalise, to use a difficult word, to monumentalise where they're burying their dead. And the fouillage is not only sort of one of the very earliest examples of this in Guernsey, but in a much wider landscape as well. It's really exceptionally rare to get burial mounds that early in this part of northwest France. So I suppose for me that's one of the key features about it, is just because here's the sort of the first places that these early farmers, early settlers were actually, something changed in their culture and society that they started marking the place where they were burying their dead. And because it's like the precursor to places like the Vard and the Lihou, which we haven't, you could easily talk about them for hours yet, which are very special in their own way. So yeah, it's the start of something big, I suppose you could say. Yeah.
Tanya?
Well, I would have said that as well, but the longevity of the use always, I don't know, inspires my imagination really, how things were changing over time. This initial date of 4,800 right down to 2000 BC, and did it stop there? I mean, we've got this so-called, I shouldn't put it like that, we've got this evidence of occupation nearby where maybe people were living, but maybe they weren't living there. Maybe they were coming and still leaving offerings there. And this continuation through the memory of the people that were living there and the stories that there would have been around all this, which we'll never know now, and comparing it to our own, our own history and our churches and how rituals change and how people behave. A lot of archaeological sites have that aspect, but the Fouaillages has it really, really strongly because it embraces such a very long time period, and it has these complex phases of use as well that hopefully the publication will one day untangle beautifully with lots of diagrams and reconstruction pictures of what it was all like.
And John, it must be very special for you to see work continuing on a site that you discovered.
Very, very much, yes, because I'd sort of given up on it mentally, that ever it would never get published. It takes a certain amount of resources, a certain amount of funds, but also a certain amount of expertise. It couldn't be done by me or anybody here, so we've always relied on our help from the mainland and very often from universities, but in this case from the museum services in Britain. And so I'm really looking forward to the fact that it will ultimately get published after 60 years? No, 50 years. Yeah.
That's fantastic. It's a great way to finish up. I just want to thank you all for your time. It's been great. Thank you. Thank you for tuning into this podcast. If you've got all this way, I'm really hoping that you've enjoyed our work. There's a few things you can do, though, to support us. Follow, like, subscribe, share, whatever you can do to help spread the word of the Quarry. The other thing you can do is head on over to our website, where you can become a member and really support independent local news.